Hi everyone, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started now that I think we have everyone on. Apologies for the delay. We are so thrilled to be with you today and be able to present to you this new report, Start with Equity from the Early Years to the Early Grades, where we take a deep dive into the data, into the research base, and into the policy landscape on 3 key equity issues in our early learning and early elementary systems today. We present an actionable policy agenda at the end of this. So before we jump in, I'm going to hand it over to Linda Smith from the Bipartisan Policy Center to give a few opening remarks, and then we'll jump in. Linda? Not getting any sound.
Chantel, can you hear me?
Yeah, there you go. There you are.
Okay. Sorry, I think I'm having technical difficulties here. Can you hear me, Chantel?
Yeah, there's a lot of feedback. It might be if you're on with your phone at the same time, it might be echoing.
I turned my phone off, so I hope we're good to go. Okay. Okay, well, thank you, Chantel, and sorry for the mix-up on the technology. As you know, it's not my strong suit. I can honestly say that. I want to welcome everyone here to this webinar and thank Chantel for all the work on this. I wanted to start this out by sort of giving a little bit of an overview of how we got to this point. And I want to just say that for the most part, for many of you on this phone call know that Chantel and I work together at the Administration for Children and Families and spent a lot of time looking at early childhood systems in this country. During our time there, we spent a fair amount of time looking at things like the expulsion data that had come out several years ago, then looking at how we were handling and treating children in terms of inclusion in early childhood settings, and were they integrated and included in settings, or were they in separate programs? And then we also spent a fair amount of time looking at dual language learners and how are we bringing them into our programs. And what we found in our work was exactly the opposite, I think, of what we wanted to find. And that is that we had a lot of issues in our programs with children being expelled from programs early, that we had children who were segregated into special education programs, special needs programs by themselves and not integrated into early childhood programs, and pull-out programs for dual language learners. So what was the common thread that we had there? We looked at this and thought we have an early childhood system that should be inclusive and instead was based on exclusion, expulsion, and segregation of children at the time when it's the easiest actually to include children in our work and to have them in our programs. So I think this report is kind of an outgrowth of that, of the work that we did during that time and trying to look at where are we. So as you can tell from the report, we brought together jointly 70 experts from across the country over the last about year and a half and examined these issues, looking at the research and so forth. And I think what we have in this report is something that is irrefutable and a strong case for re-examining our early childhood systems, especially now that so many of these issues have been exposed during the COVID-19 experience. So I wanted to just start out by saying that we need to do better in this country. We can create a better, more inclusive early care and learning system. And the time is right now to start with equity for all our children. So I want to just say, by way of introduction of Chantel, it is really an honor for me to introduce her and to have her present this report to you. she deserves really the credit for this report in its entirety. She's done an outstanding job. She's the primary author of the report, and her passion for this subject shows in every section of the report. You will see and hear through her presentation how much this means to her. And so my hat's off to her and the 70 people who joined us in working on this report. Finally, I just want to acknowledge Heising Simons and Barbara Chow for their support of this work as well, because I think this is important and more important than we ever expected, given the timeliness of what's going on in our country. So with that, I hand it back over to Chantel and she will give you the top line findings and research from the report. And thanks, Chantel, and congratulations on a great job here.
Thank you, Linda. So before we jump into the content of the report, I wanted to do just a bit of contextualizing that I think is necessary. The violent murder of George Floyd and so many other Black Americans in this country has forced another racial reckoning in the United States. Calls for racial justice and equity are coming from places that they've never really come before. Protesters led by Black Americans have forced open an opportunity for change unlike we've seen in a generation or more. I was on a much more interesting webinar than this is going to be a few weeks ago with the panelists were Barack Obama, John Lewis, and Bryan Stevenson. The first question out of the gate from the moderator was, what is the one word that encapsulates how you feel right now? This was a couple weeks after George Floyd's murder. Barack Obama responded, motivated. John Lewis said, faith. And Bryan Stevenson said, determined. The energy that we've seen around racial injustice and dismantling systemic racism these last 2 months have been something to see. Statues finally coming down, certain sports teams' names getting changed and removing racial slurs, Black Lives Matter painted prominently on major US streets, and that's all really necessary and really, really important, but it's insufficient. The hard work of funneling that energy into public policy is what needs to follow. The policy agenda we present here is actionable, it's concrete, it's specific, and it provides a pathway to build a greater equity, at least within the early childhood and early education systems. As we all know, any reform agenda for racial justice has to include one of the first systems that children encounter outside the home, and that's childcare, and that's pre-K, and that's the early grades. Because racism exists here too. It feeds and it's accompanied by ableism and xenophobia and lots of other isms, and it manifests in different ways and affects different groups of kids in different ways. But the common denominator is that it gets in the way. It puts up unnecessary obstacles. It keeps our kids from reaching their potential. We've heard lots of Black Americans say, we're not looking for a handout, we're looking for a fair chance. Just get out of the way and remove the obstacles. We hope that some of the recommendations that we present here do just that, remove these obstacles and let more kids thrive. So with that, I'm gonna jump in to our main presentation and give you a bit of a taste of what's in our report. So we chose to focus on 3 key issue areas for a few reasons. The first reason is that the 3 issue areas we chose to focus on disproportionately hurt and affect kids from historically marginalized communities. Black children, brown children, Native American children, children with disabilities. They also share the common theme of exclusion. Physical exclusion, exclusion from pedagogy and general education curriculum that we know works, exclusion from learning alongside their peers, exclusion in lots of different ways. And I also want to say that these 3 things aren't everything, right? Even if we address all 3 of these, our systems won't be fair, let alone the many inequities outside of our learning systems in everything from health to wealth to housing. But addressing these 3 enabled us to engage deeply with the research and provide an actionable policy agenda, and will help us make progress toward getting to the ultimate goal that we all want to get to. So those 3 issue areas are addressing harsh discipline and its disproportionate application, expanding inclusive learning opportunities for kids with disabilities, and expanding equitable access to high quality learning opportunities for our dual language learners and our English learners. So here's a bit of an overview of what we found. We looked at themes across the 3 areas, and then we engaged deeply with each individual area. When we looked at our themes across areas, the first thing we found is that racial disparities exist across every area, across ages, across systems, and across every state and within states. They're everywhere. We found that they are fueled by bias, they are fueled by bad policy, by poor implementation of policy in some ways, and lack of monitoring and accountability. They're fueled by a lack of investment in supportive investments like social emotional learning and mental health consultants and other kind of supportive resources that help social emotional development. We learned that teacher preparation, and this might not be shocking to folks, but teacher preparation and professional development is sorely inadequate in addressing equity. We learned that segregation is quite common, particularly for kids with disabilities and English learners. As a reminder, we did not look at racial segregation in this report, but we all obviously know that that's also a big challenge. We learned that programs that have been designed to support historically marginalized communities are severely underfunded and in fact starved. We learned that there are policy differences, major policy differences across state lines and within state lines, with education being so local. We learned that monitoring, as I mentioned before, and accountability, and kind of tying those two together is a really big problem. In some of these areas, we already have pretty strong policy or standards or a law to support inclusivity, but the implementation and kind of the monitoring and accountability is significantly lacking. We also know that there are some major data gaps across these 3 areas that we'll dig into a little bit more as we continue going down the road. So we provided a number of recommendations, and this is just a summary of them, that are kind of cross-cutting that affect all of these issue areas. The first one is really to fully fund programs designed to support kids from historically marginalized communities and fund them equitably, which means taking into account the historical marginalization and the underinvestment that has been placed in these communities and for these kids for so long. The second one that we recommend is really requiring states to make equity plans and to build equity plans, and to require equity plans in applications for federal funding, and to require progress on those equity plans for continued federal funding. The other is, again, you'll see this as a theme, is to really shore up monitoring and accountability at the federal level and at the state level, and all the way down, because it really sets a tone and it sets a pattern. If the feds aren't looking, then the states are less likely to look, right? So it kind of goes all the way down the road there. Prioritize inclusive learning. In any new reauthorizations of existing laws, in any new laws, in any kind of regulations moving forward, through all of the levers that we have, really promoting integrated learning by language, by disability, as we focus on in this report, by race, and by socioeconomic status, among others. Supporting educator preparation and development that's really grounded in equity. Equity can't be an add-on or a one-off training. That's not going to cause the true transformation that we need to change behaviors. We need preparation programs, and we need development programs and continued coaching that really get at the root of this and provide a deep understanding for equity in diverse populations. Funding longitudinal disaggregated data to better understand child wellness across a number of these indicators, and including funding in any upcoming stimulus bills on equitable access to early education, not just general, but equitable. So I'm going to dive in now to each of the individual issue areas that we covered. The first issue area is harsh discipline. And I should say, and I'll mention it again at the end with some more dates, but we are hosting 3 additional webinars where we're going to take deeper dives into each of these individual issue areas. So for today, I'm just going to touch on each one, but in our subsequent webinars, we'll take a much deeper dive to show what we found. So here's what we know about harsh discipline and disparities in discipline in the early grades and the early years. We know that it starts early, we know that it happens often, and we know that it's disproportionate all the way across, with Black children and boys and children with disabilities being disproportionately targets. And Black boys with disabilities being kind of the most disproportionately affected by this. We know that there is not one shred of evidence that this harsh type of discipline works to improve child development, to improve, classroom climate, to improve anything. There's no evidence that there's any positive that comes out of harsh discipline. And I should say that we define harsh discipline as suspension and expulsion, corporal punishment, and seclusion. And we'll talk about seclusion in just a minute, but those are kind of the key areas, and also restraint used inappropriately. We know that harsh discipline rates vary drastically across states and even within state lines. We know, again, similar to the cross-cutting finding that I mentioned earlier, that a lot of what's driving the disparities is implicit bias in decision-making, is misguided policies, is poor working conditions for the early care and education workforce. So we know that folks who work longer hours without adequate breaks, folks who don't have a lifeline like coaches and other supports to come and help, really understand how to meet every child's needs, we know that they are more likely to suspend and expel. So really these poor working conditions. We can't ignore the low compensation that a lot of our childcare field gets, and kind of the stress and everything surrounding that comes with that. Again, lack of support resources, things like positive behavior intervention support or mental health consultation and other interventions, and school climate. We know that there are a handful of interventions, the ones I just mentioned, that decrease exclusionary discipline and have been found to decrease exclusionary discipline. But we know that very few have looked at closing disparities in exclusionary discipline. Positive behavior intervention support has started making gains on that end, but I'd say it's still early. Mental health consultation, I think there's a number of small studies, again, very early in development, but no one kind of approached their evaluation with this kind of tenet in mind and central. So there's an evidence base that was built showing kind of the improvements in social emotional development, the decreases in expulsion and suspension, but the question of disparity and closing that gap wasn't central to those evaluations. And so we're excited to see that that's an emerging and growing area. We know that harsh discipline is largely unregulated at the federal level, with the exception of some really modest protections for kids with disabilities in certain instances. It is largely state and locally driven. We also know that there's been a large influx of state and community level policies since 2014. 2014 was the year the Child Care and Development Block Grant passed with new language on suspension and expulsion. So that really started a lot of executive action at the state level on suspension and expulsion. It was also the year that we released the civil rights data collection data for preschool children for the first time. So that was really lifted up and prompted legislation, particularly in pre-K and in the early grades after that happened. We also know, however, that despite this influx of lots and lots of policy in different forms through policy statements and through legislation and through regulation in some ways and through other types of executive actions, that the quality of those policies greatly varied. So the extent of the protections for children varied. the breadth of how much of the system the policy covered varied. The list of accepted behaviors for which a child could be expelled varied. So we've seen some places that list like 20 reasons why a child might be expelled or suspended, many of which are developmentally appropriate. So, you know, the investments paired with the policy for social emotional development and teacher training and other sorts of supports, that also varied. So we see a really wide range of quality when it comes to policy. So I'm just going to touch on this really quickly. We did analysis looking at pre-K through 5th grade, really that early ed through the early grades in kind of public systems. And we did it state by state. And what we did was we compared to control for population for every 1,000 kids, for every 1,000 Black children, how many were suspended? For every 1,000 other non-Black children, how many were suspended? And then we compared the difference to kind of calculate a disparity and a difference there. And you'll see from this map, there was no state that had no difference. Every single state in the country, Black children were more likely to be pushed out. The darker red color here you'll see were the states that had the largest degree of difference in rates, with Ohio actually getting the crown for having the worst and highest disparity, and Hawaii having the lowest disparity. We also looked at corporal punishment by state. And we wanted to do this because corporal punishment is only legal in 19 states, and we'll get into that in just a second. But it is legal in 19 states in public settings, and it is legal in every state in the nation except 2 in private school settings. These data are from public settings, and again, it is at pre-K to 5th grade. It's that young end of the young, the student spectrum. And what we found too, there wasn't the same degree of racial disparity in every state. And where you see the arrows here pointed is, some of the states that were driving the largest disparities. So for Black children, we saw Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas have some of the largest disparities. For example, in Mississippi or Louisiana, for example, Black children made up less than half of the population, but they made up over 60% of suspensions. If you look on the right side of your screen, the other 2 arrows are for our American Indian Alaska Native children. We also saw significant disparities with them. But these 2 states that we're pointing out were particularly egregious examples, where in North Carolina, they make up just a little over 1% of the population, but over 11% of corporal punishment cases. In Oklahoma, similarly, they make up a little over 11% of the population, but over 23%, almost a quarter of all suspensions in the early grades. Now, really quickly, I'll jump into seclusion, but just so that we're all on the same page, because this isn't one of the issue areas that has gotten a whole lot of attention in the early ed space. Seclusion, as is defined in the Civil Rights Data Collection, is when you basically lock a child in a room without the ability to get out. You may have seen news stories about it. Once every few years, there are investigative stories about this quite egregious practice that kind of flowed up again. Most recently, there was a story from Illinois. But I think what I want you to take away from this graph is that there are only 2 states in the entire nation that ban seclusion outright in young kids. And so everybody else allows it to some degree, and for some groups of students and for some instances. So what are our recommendations to address this? Again, this is just a sampling of our recommendations. We encourage you to read the report and look at the full policy agenda, but I'll touch on some of the top lines here. The first piece is really we need to pass federal legislation on discipline reform that prohibits seclusion, that prohibits corporal punishment, and that prohibits exclusionary discipline in young children, any programs that are receiving any sort of federal money. We need to address discipline in IDEA and get rid of the allowance that is currently in there for 10-day suspension for children with disabilities, and tighten up restrictions around restraint and disallow seclusion as well. We need to prioritize and invest in at the federal level, again, on these supportive, positive measures that heal and support and help kids thrive as opposed to measures that are meant to exclude, like school resource officers. In terms of federal agency recommendations, we talk about reinstating federal guidance that discourages exclusionary discipline and that really monitors civil rights violations and disparate impact of exclusionary discipline. We talk about requiring states to report what their exclusionary discipline looks like and disparities in that discipline in childcare settings, because we really have no sense of that in the data right now. We talk about raising awareness about the negative impacts of exclusion and suspension, really using the bully pulpit for that. And we talk about tying federal funds to state progress in reducing disparities across these harsh forms of discipline. At the state level, we similarly recommend prohibiting the harsh forms of discipline I mentioned before, investing in data systems and professional training systems, and moving on to the district level. Similarly, kind of you'll see these kind of nested at different levels. You know, districts that reside in states that allow corporal punishment, for example, have the option not to use corporal punishment. And so even if folks do live in those states where corporal punishment is legal, districts can decide and make the policy to not use it. And so we recommend some of those kind of nested approaches across. So the next area that we're going to talk about is segregated learning, and really the lack of inclusion that we've seen of kids with disabilities in general learning settings. So here's a quick review of what we know. We know that for inclusion, there is a strong research base that shows that it works. Kids with and without disabilities do better in inclusive settings when kids with disabilities are included. We know that we have quite a strong law that is clear about prioritizing inclusive placement for kids with disabilities. But we also know that despite those two things, that progress has been slow. It has been painfully slow. In fact, today, less than half of all preschoolers with disabilities are receiving their services in a general early childhood program. And most of these kids have language delays or disabilities. Although there is no bad candidate for inclusion regardless of the severity of the disability, but the fact that children this young are already being tracked in kind of segregated settings is disturbing. We know that most infants and toddlers are served in the natural environment, which is in the home, but that changes when they get to pre-K. We know that when we get to the school age group of kids, that Black and Latino kids are less likely to spend the majority of their school day in general education settings. We know that there are lots of barriers to inclusion, not the least of which is ableism. So attitudes and beliefs about kids with disabilities, about folks' ability and capacity to actually implement inclusion are often cited as some of the top reasons. Lack of workforce preparation, lack of oversight and accountability, again, kind of at the federal level, down to the state level, and downward to the community level, and uncoordinated systems. So we have childcare, we have Head Start, we have pre-K, we have the K-12, we have the special ed system, and they're not always coordinated. We know that public pre-K expansion over the last several years has not resulted in an expansion of inclusive slots for kids with disabilities. So although the general public pre-K has expanded over here, the segregated kind of special ed pre-K program has remained over here as opposed to becoming integrated. And because of that, we know that pre-K is an underutilized tool to expand inclusion, and there's a lot of potential there to do so, but it hasn't met that promise yet. So just to give you a brief example of the great state variability in percentage of kids who are included, here we see that kids in Colorado, Nebraska, Wyoming, Vermont, for example, about 3/4 or more of them are included in general learning settings, whereas in states like Louisiana, not even 1 in 5 are included. So there is great state variability. And it was outside the scope of this report to look within states at the district level, but I can tell you that we know that there is a great amount of variability and inclusion within state lines as well. So I mentioned earlier that pre-K is not correlated, pre-K access in a state is not correlated to the percent of kids who are included, percent of kids with disabilities who are included. And this is just kind of to illustrate, this is a table from the report that kind of puts those two, for every state in the nation, puts up the percentage of coverage of general pre-K and the percentage of kids with disabilities in inclusive settings in those same states. And what we find is in some of these states that have pretty high percentage 4-year-olds enrolled in pre-K, like Florida, like Oklahoma, like West Virginia even, that have upwards of 65, 75% of kids enrolled, they're 4-year-olds, the percentage of kids with disabilities enrolled in inclusive settings is like 40 percentage points or more lower than that. So we see a great amount of kind of inconsistency there. So the recommendations for kids with disabilities, first and foremost, Congress needs to fully fund IDEA and kind of, but what we mean by that is its commitment to IDEA that was originally in the law. We need to, in addition to fully funding IDEA, also increase funding for infants and toddlers, and for Part D of IDEA, which gets to monitoring and accountability and technical assistance and training efforts. We recommend requesting 3 GAO, Government Accountability Office studies on IDEA. One on what the cost is to fully fund high quality inclusive services for kids with disabilities, what the costs are to not fully fund that, and how that detrimentally affects children. And to look at greater depth into the equity and IDEA rule that was passed back in 2016 at the end of the Obama administration, really look at what the implementation of that rule has been at the federal, at the state, and at the local level. In terms of our federal agency recommendations for this one, monitoring and accountability is really big. So at this point, the Department of Education does monitor for least restrictive environment provisions, so the extent to which kids are included. But it does not take that into account in determining how well a state is doing or future federal funding. And it does not take any indicator, any monitoring indicator for early childhood into account at all. So clearly we think that needs to change. Really trying to incentivize meaningful structural inclusion reforms through federal grants like the preschool development grants. And really ensuring, partnering, kind of forging a partnership between Department of Justice, Education, Health and Human Services to ensure that childcare programs are ADA compliant and have the supports they need to be ADA compliant. In terms of states, similarly, kind of going down, there needs to be more monitoring accountability for inclusion at the state level to districts. We need to, our other recommendation is pulling from Head Start standards. So Head Start has a requirement that 10% of enrollment be kids with disabilities. And we've seen that as an effective tool to ensure that Head Start programs are inclusive and serve children with disabilities in inclusive settings with their peers. Our recommendation is to expand that requirement to public pre-K programs. Ensuring IEP teams are well-trained and accountable for making inclusive placement decisions, and really deploying teams and providing technical assistance at the state level to local communities and districts, really trying to target those that have the greatest problems and the greatest segregated learning settings and percentage of kids in those separate settings. At the district level, we recommend a number of, again, this is really where the meat of it is, at the district level, at the local level, looking at budgets and shifting around budgets, looking at personnel and how you have different teachers in different programs and how we can layer special educators and models that, that would enable inclusion and get rid of the, move away from the segregation model. Training IEP teams on inclusion, formalizing partnerships with high quality community-based early childhood programs to expand the number of inclusive slots that schools have to play with when they're deciding on placement decisions. So the third piece that we looked at was for dual language learners. And really we kind of focused our review in this section and our focus on access to dual language immersion and other kind of bilingual learning models. So what we found is that, not surprisingly, this isn't a great reveal, but DLLs have great cultural, linguistic, and cognitive strengths, including a whole array of cognitive advantages that come along with bilingualism. There is a robust body of research on baby brain science that kind of looks at all of the benefits of being exposed to more than one language early on, and how that kind of translates and is associated with increases in executive functioning and other types of really important behaviors that we know are important to school readiness later on. We also know that DLLs and ELs do better in bilingual learning models, or in dual language immersion models, as we call them. We know that there is some limited data that suggests, and a whole lot of anecdotal data that suggests that DLLs and ELs are underrepresented in bilingual and dual language immersion models. We know that there's been an explosion in interest and excitement and support for bilingual learning across the country. But we also know that as a country, we've perceived bilingualism as really prestigious and like a really great enrichment to kind of get ahead for one group of kids. But if we have English learners and DLLs who come to our doors being bilingual, that is seen as something we kind of need to get rid of, and we need to really immerse them in English, and as opposed to pull out that bilingualism as the strength. And that is a challenge, and we're seeing as a trend, an early trend, that ELs are being underrepresented in these programs, that for some kids, for kids who speak English at home already, bilingual programs are a really great enrichment. Like, I wish we had bilingual programs for everybody. But for DLLs and for ELs, it's a much higher stake situation. It could determine whether or not they have access to general education, to the curriculum, whether or not they can communicate with their teacher, whether or not they're segregated and pushed to a separate program to be immersed in English only. So we see the stakes being higher. We know that, again, similar to these other areas, that standards vary greatly across states. We know that Head Start has some of the best and most comprehensive standards on dual language learners to support dual language learners, but the implementation varies. We know that no state has kind of a comprehensive set of quality standards for DLLs, and in fact, 18 state public pre-K programs have no policies for DLLs at all. A recent NEAR report found that finding. We also know that funding for DLLs and ELs has been woefully inadequate and insufficient. Type 3 has been stagnant, which is the piece that includes funding in the nation's education law, and has not kept up with inflation or the increase in numbers of English learners. So just to jump in with a little bit more depth and detail into the dual language immersion and bilingual learning and why that's so important. The research is quite clear here. DLLs who are able to engage in bilingual programs are in high quality dual language programs. They learn English quicker. They outperform their peers in math and in reading. They reach academic norms, and they become biliterate, which we know has economic benefits later on. There's really kind of no contest here. And native English speakers in these programs also outperform their peers in a number of areas. So the bulk of the research has been in K-12 spaces, but there has been, a handful or more studies in early ed that finds a similar type of pattern, that finds that preschoolers who are in dual language models outperform their peers in math and reading and English proficiency. There's a recent study looking at Head Start programs, comparing Head Start programs who did a dual language immersion model versus those that did primarily English with a little bit of home language sprinkled in. And they found that the dual language immersion program, that kids came out with higher English and Spanish proficiency. And so again, kind of showing the benefit of this type of model. There's also the non-academic benefits that have been recorded, like orienting to tasks, attention, tolerating frustrating tasks. And if you think about what those things mean for learning and perseverance and work ethic, they're just as important as some of these academic findings. So when we look at our recommendations in this space, the first one is to really increase funding and at least get Title II up to par and doubling it, which would barely take into account inflation and the increased numbers of ELs in this country. Requesting some more GAO studies to get a better sense of federal funding, existing federal funding on English learners and where that's going and how it's being spent and how it's working. Finally, aligning policy with research in this space and prioritizing bilingual and dual language approaches that build on children's linguistic strengths and phasing out English only and pull out models altogether. And then, because one of the barriers to greater expansion of dual language immersion is the lack of the workforce, really funding an effort to expand the number of bilingual educators, qualified bilingual educators in the country. In the federal agencies, again, you'll see a lot of themes kind of nested throughout. Piloting and investing in strength-based bilingual approaches. Investing in assessment. We know assessment is a big problem, and we touch a lot more on that in the report. And requiring states to report their plans to equitably expand dual language immersion. So there are lots of cities and some states that are expanding dual language immersion. Equity is not always integrated in that conversation. ELs and DLLs need to be at the front of the line in those expansions, and they need to kind of come first because the stakes are so much higher in equity. Finally, at the state level, we talk about, again, discontinuing segregated programs for ELs. We know they're harmful. We know they're ineffective. We know they're not any better at ensuring kids learn English. They require oftentimes segregation. Kids miss out on math and science and everything else during the school day. And there are major civil rights concerns with them to underline all of that. Using federal funds and kind of accompanying that with state funds to get at more DL and EL bilingual model expansion. Adopting Head Start dual language learner standards at the state level for public pre-K. And making sure that that is tied to monitoring and accountability and funding. So that always has, like, standards never suffice on their own. I think we've seen in many of these examples, kind of tying all those pieces together is really critical to implementation. And then finally, improving the existing and creating new workforce preparation programs to expand linguistic diversity and knowledge in our early educators and in our K-12 educators and in our childcare providers as well. So with that, I am going to now transition to our panel and stop sharing my screen. We have a really esteemed panel that I am so pleased to be with us today. We have Dr. Jean Garcia, who is a professor emeritus at Arizona State University. We have Dr. Rosemary Allen, who is an associate professor at Metropolitan State University in Denver. And we have Dr. Mary Louise Hemmeter, who is a professor at Vanderbilt University. So Linda and I are going to moderate this discussion, and I'm going to stop sharing. There we go. I'm going to kick off the first question. And I'm going to kick it to Rosemary, but I'd love for Jean and Mary Louise to also pipe in here. So I started our presentation with a little bit of contextualizing and kind of talking about this really unique moment we find ourselves in American history, and this moment in equity. So can you speak to and can you contextualize the findings in this policy agenda in this report with the current uprising against social injustice in this country? Is this time different? And if so, what do we have to do to get the inequities affecting our babies on the agenda? Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you so much, Chantel. Thank you for the overview and summary of this amazing report. I love the way that you contextualized everything. And I just want to say that we have to keep in mind that the young people who are protesting in the street right now were our preschoolers just in 2005, 2003. That even though they are protesting today, there's a lot that we can do to make sure that today's preschoolers are not protesting tomorrow. The time is now. It is different. We're seeing a multi-racial, multi-age, multi-generational protest. And the time is right, not only because of what we're seeing in terms of civil unrest, but what we're seeing with COVID-19 that allows us to really focus on what's happening without a lot of distractions. We have to understand that our gaps are widening. The discipline gap is much greater today than the very first discipline study that took place in 1975 with the Children's Defense Fund. We have to understand the power of our early childhood programs to address these inequities, because it's in our early childhood programs where future doctors are sitting, where future lawyers are sitting, where future bankers, future police officers are sitting. And these are the very people that we are going to be counting on to address health inequities, to address inequities in policing, to address inequities in lending. But it starts very, very young. And when we fail to address inequities in our early childhood spaces, then what we're doing is contributing to the equities that we'll be seeing that will continue not only today, but in the generation to come.
This is Gene. I'd like to expand a little bit on Rosemary. I mean, I think what this has done again, unfortunately, is demonstrate inequities throughout all sectors of our society. This is a persistent phenomena that certainly your report addresses around 3 issues. But you have to remember this is a inequity across all sectors. And so it reminds us that we have to address that. And this report, again, helps us do that. On the demographic side, I think a present context, we realize that diversity is real. And not only is our inequities real, but 32% of the kids in the area that I work are dual language learners from age 0 to 8. If you add African-American youngsters, if you add our families, if you add indigenous populations, you see that the new real diversity in this country. It's almost like this diversity is invisible right in front of our eyes. And I think that's what this does for me, is that we have to recognize this is not the United States of 40 or 50 years ago. This is very new. And we appreciate essentially bringing the attention to some of these inequities in our society.
I'll just say one thing, because Jean and Rosemary certainly said much of what I'm feeling, which is that I one time heard a parent of a young child with a disability say, the children in his life today are going to be the adults in his life tomorrow. And I think that we need to hang on to that and think about where can we create change. And Rosemary, as much as I hope the preschoolers of today aren't having to advocate or protest the way that they are, that our preschoolers from 2005 are today, I hope that our preschoolers are growing up in a context in which that's going to be less of a demand because of what we're doing with them during these early years. And I think the things that Chantel has highlighted today suggest we're not doing what we need to do in the early years to keep them from having to protest in 20 years.
Thank you so much, Dr. Himmeter, because that's my hope and that's my dream. But my son was a preschooler in 2004, and he is now an activist fighting against these injustices. And if we don't do something, that will be our reality. And from what we're looking at across the board, when we talk about harsh discipline, when we talk about inclusion, when we talk about English language learners, we're not making the progress we should be making. So we're going to have to be a lot more intentional. One of the things I've learned in the last month or two is that it's possibility. Everything we were told would take time. We have to slow down. We have to look at the facts. We have to find funding. All of that went out the window because when we had to do it, we did it. So we can do this. Everything right now is possible.
This is Linda, and I want to follow on that and thank you to the panel or the discussants on this. I think that we've seen, you know, a lot of data and research, and Chantel's given a very excellent and comprehensive overview of the issues. On a personal level, can you each speak to what you have seen with families? I think one of the things that we sometimes miss in these conversations are where are the parents, where are the children, what's really going on out there with our families. Rosemary, you're on, so why don't you start?
Overall, right now with the civil unrest and COVID, what I'm seeing with families is a lot of fear, actually. When we talk about inequities, right now they've been amplified. I just received a text while Chantel was speaking about from one of the parents whose school childcare facility needs to close because they've had so many positive cases. She's tried to talk to her employer to see if she could work remotely. The employer told her, you need to find another childcare center rather than trying to adjust your hours. So families are stuck in the middle right now between trying to take care of themselves, take care of their children, and also make sure that they can earn a living. The other thing that we saw, especially as early childhood facilities were slowly opening up, was the inequities in terms of who got the slots. Here in Colorado, when we first started reopening, there were only 10 children to a room. So the inequities in terms of who gets those slots, because subsidy doesn't pay as much as parent pay, it was a great fear that children on subsidy, children who had special needs, children who were deemed those with challenging behaviors would not get those 10 coveted slots in that classroom. So while inequities persist, at times like this, they're more amplified.
Jean, what about you?
Yeah, what we're seeing in families and communities, I'm going to extend this to communities, is a deep concern, sometimes even a fear for their young children. They're sending them off to situations which may not understand them, their culture, may not be able to communicate with their children and with the family. So these are very significant family and community issues. As a higher ed administrator, I worry about the people we place in those situations to serve those families and communities. So it is this notion of interacting between parents, families in general, and individuals who are intending to support, to develop, to teach the children of those families and those communities. That intersection is one that is at this moment very fragile, and unfortunately needs a lot more attention than we're giving it at the moment.
Oh, wow. And Mary Louise, how about you?
Yeah, this is kind of fresh on my mind. I'm like Rosemary, I'm getting texts and emails all the time about these issues, specifically as it relates to children with disabilities. And so all those inequities around which kids are going to get those slots are kind of rearing around kids with disabilities. And so a couple of things that have happened in the last week are a program that said to me, well, we don't think we can let the kids with disabilities come back because of the legal implications. Like they're somehow going to be sicker than other kids, right? Yes, some children with disabilities might be at higher risk, but there's nothing about children with disabilities in general that would make them at risk. So it's kind of looking for a way to exclude children with disabilities at this time. And then the opposite side of that is that there are some families of children with disabilities who don't feel comfortable with them going back into these settings for whatever reasons. But the problem is that we don't have any good ways. Well, there are probably good ways, but we haven't figured them out to serve children with disabilities from a distance. And so what we've heard over and over from parents of kids with disabilities is they're just not getting their services that are on their IEPs because of the remote technology issues.
Interesting. You know, my daughter is a special education teacher, and she's been trying to teach remotely, and there are very big challenges to that. Chantel, do you want to take the next question?
Yeah, I want to just drill down a little bit. I know you all kind of focused on the community level and what you're generally seeing with COVID. I want you to tell me about a child or a family that stands out in your head and keeps you up at night for good or for bad. That kind of brings the true human costs and issues in the equity conversations that we're talking about, either personal or through your work or through what you've seen in your long careers in this space. Rosemary, do you want to start?
Sure. When I'm asked to share a story, the saddest part about that for me is that there are so many stories to share. And what we know is that children who are suspended are more likely to be suspended, and then they're deemed troublemakers in the classroom. I had a call from a parent. Her child was suspended. He was suspended because he would not sit in his chair during small group time. And the teacher first labeled him aggressive. And the parent challenged that because she knew him to be a very soft-spoken, quiet, compliant child. And the teacher said, well, he's aggressively not sitting. And she tried to qualify that. And no one could understand what was happening. He was suspended for 3 days, and I accompanied the family to the reentry meeting. And it turned out that the child would not sit in his chair because the children around him kept patting his afro and calling him spongy head. Spongy head. And being the quiet, compliant kid that he was, he didn't fight back, he didn't argue, he just wouldn't sit down. As long as he was standing, they couldn't reach his head. And it just saddened me to know that this child lost 3 days of instruction, 3 days of learning, 3 days of interacting, simply because the teacher didn't see him. And it was much easier when we talk about how these systems work together through her bias. And we know that big Black boys, as Dr. Gilliam reminds us, are most likely to be suspended. Through her bias, this is a Black boy, he was very big for his age, of course, an African-American child, that her bias did not allow her to see him as the victim. And it was much easier to suspend this child simply because other children were petting him like a puppy. He never fought back and he was so quiet, but to suspend him without even understanding or knowing why. And unfortunately, this happens across this country all the time. My greatest fear for this child now is that he has been suspended and now it's on his record. And my hope is that he won't be in that churn of being suspended again and again, as research tells us could very well happen.
I want to tell you about Ernie. Ernie comes from a farm worker family, speaking Spanish at home with about 8 brothers and sisters. Down syndrome, parents don't understand what that means, and sends Ernie to school. What happens at school is that the place called school, at kindergarten at least, no one could understand Ernie. They knew he was Down syndrome, but they couldn't communicate to him or to his parents. They asked his older brother to take him home because they didn't know what to do with him. Now, there are more Ernies today, and their names are Abdul, Lein, and Jose, maybe. And by the way, Ernie was my brother, and I was the one who had taken him home.
Wow.
Wow. Well, so my response to this question is to say, do I want to tell a success story or a way that inequities have negatively affected a child? And I think I want to tell a story that is both. So I'm going to try to do this really quickly. So a few years ago, I was with a friend who's also a colleague who has a child with CP. And her daughter is mobile, walks with a walker, has a great communication system, has always been fully included in public schools, has always gotten the support she needed. And we ran into some friends of theirs who have a daughter the same age, who was in a wheelchair, was not able to navigate the wheelchair alone, did not have verbal language, did not have a good did not have any alternative communication system. And after they left, my friend said our girls were in early intervention together. And so the two kids had started off in an early childhood inclusive setting together, and they were known for being a lot like each other. So they both started out in inclusive settings. They both started out doing well. And the other little girl went on to a segregated classroom where she remained until we saw her. And I was talking to my friend about what happened, what was the difference? And the difference was that, and I want to be really careful here about making this clear, which is the difference is that my friend and her husband were special educators, and they knew their rights, and they knew how to demand to the school board that their kid get what they needed. They knew to not sign that IEP if the child wasn't going to get what they wanted. They knew all that. They had the resources, they had the time, they had the knowledge, they had the experience, and the other child's mother didn't. And what that says to me is not something about the parents, but it says to me that for children with disabilities to be in inclusive settings, parents have to be heroes, rather than schools giving them what they deserve, what they are entitled to, what they should be getting under federal law. And our schools don't, I want to say this generically, and I know there are places that do it well, but I really believe for the average child with a disability to be in an inclusive setting and get the supports they need, their parents have to be heroes, when really the schools should be the heroes. The schools should be making sure that happens without parents having to do all of that work.
Well, we have gone through and laid out, and Chantel laid out a lot of policy recommendations. I think what we'd like to hear from each of you is, in your particular areas of expertise and substantial experience, what are the 1 to 2 top policy recommendations that you'd like to see implemented in this country? Mary Louise, you're on camera, so let's start with you.
Okay. Except I want about 10, but I'll say the 2 that I feel the strongest about. One is that we've got to fund Part C. And for those of y'all who don't know what Part C is Services for Infants and Toddlers with Disabilities. And I'm going to tell a very quick story about why this is important. So I went to work with a principal who was having trouble with a family because they wanted their kindergartner fully included. And I said, well, what's wrong with that? And he said, well, they're one of those preschool families. And what that meant was they were one of those families who had gone through early intervention and a really good, high quality, community-based, inclusive early childhood program and learned to fight for their child. And what that says to me is that if we fund early intervention well, we not only set children on a better trajectory, but we set families on a better trajectory if we do it well, right? So that's one. And the second one, and this is kind of a broad one, and Linda, you're going to go, yeah, I've been trying to get people to do this forever, which is that, we have a lot of money and resources going into early childhood between Head Start, early Head Start, public school pre-K, childcare, and we've got to quit treating those as 3 systems, because the vast majority of our young children spend time in childcare, and yet that's the place where we have the least support for children with disabilities. And I believe if we really want young children with disabilities to be included from the time they're babies and throughout their school year, that we've got to figure out how to do it in early childhood. And I think we can only do that if we try to build the capacity of our early care and education system as a whole.
Somebody jumped in the chat and said amen after you said part C, and I want to say amen, amen to both of them because Mary Louise, you are so dead on both of them. Let's go over to Rosemarie.
Well, like Mary Louise said, I would love to have quite a few, but just a couple that stand out for me. And Chantel talked about it in her overall summary, and that's to reinstate the federal guidance that discourages the use of exclusionary discipline. We were on such a roll. Not only did we have the federal guidance, but we also had strategies and techniques. The different departments that touch the lives of children worked together. There was some accountability. The civil rights data collection gave us the data that we needed to see what was happening that could inform and drive training and resources. So I would love to see the guidance reinstated, as well as all of the data points that talk about inequities in early childhood reinstated with the civil rights data collection. And then also to pass legislation reform that will eliminate early childhood exclusionary discipline and corporal punishment. The schools are the only institution in our country where you can hit children with weapons with impunity. It's just barbaric, and it should not happen at all across the board. And also exclusionary and harsh discipline. We know it doesn't work. So why is it allowed? We are doing harm, and we continue to implement these harmful practices that are just putting us further and further behind and actually instilling harm and causing harm to young children. So those would be my two.
So well said. Okay, Jean, how about you?
Sure. In the K-12 sector, we have a set of federal policies that essentially emanated from court decisions related to civil rights for children who come to school not speaking English. So in that federal policy, we really have ignored specifically those areas that make a difference for those kids. Focus on pre-K through third grade will make a tremendous difference in the federal policy. And of course, as the report points out, funding these areas in a substantial manner. The number of these kids has grown substantially over the last decade, but funding has remained almost non-existent in terms of growth. A focus on our ELs in the K-12 sector, particularly in the grades, is absolutely necessary if we're going to see equity, not only during those grades, but later on in their academic experience as well as in their lives. In the DLL sector, the kids, younger kids, 0 to 4, we have to look essentially at what the courts did for the K-12 sector. That is to say, if you're going to do early child education, how are you attending to the needs of those children who come to that sector not speaking English? I think we have to look at policies at the state level, at the local level, which essentially ask, is access to good, high quality early care and early education a civil right? Given the promise that this report and others have indicated for dual language learners, it's a policy area we really have to look at.
Okay. Well said. You know, I think it's an interesting thing, and we talk about it quite frequently, that, you know, we have one set of standards for children who are learning English from, you know, who speak English at home and learning English, or speak Spanish at home and learning English, versus the elite of the country who want their children to learn Spanish, and how they pay extra to have their kids do that. And I think I struggle with the sort of the inconsistencies in all of that. Chantel, I'm going to give this one back to you for the next question.
Yeah, thanks, Linda. So we covered the 3 pivotal areas in the report separately in order to kind of engage with the policy landscape deeply and concretely, but we know all of these systems overlap, and we know that there are many kids who are affected by more than one or all 3 of these issues. Can you guys each speak to the intersectionality of systems and really identify how these 2 things influence opportunity and outcomes in our learning settings? Jean, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think for our understanding is in the sector that I work in and care about so much is that there is this intersection of race and culture and language, so that there is a concern always that we have systematic and individual biases that intersect along those dimensions. We have children essentially who come to us from very diverse racial backgrounds, indigenous backgrounds, and linguistic and cultural backgrounds. And so our policies essentially are not always aligned with that understanding. In fact, in many cases, it's one size fits all. And that is just not the case with this intersection of race, culture, and language. And so the bottom line is we must attend to the notions that language that is not English is still a resource, that bilingualism is not bad, it's probably pretty good. And essentially seeing other diversities and cultures and ethnicities and race as resources instead of problems. So those are sort of the things that I see not implemented, not understood, not realized as we think about not only the policies, but the practices every day in serving these communities.
Rosemarie, do you want to chime in?
Sure. I'm thinking about the intersection of race and ability specifically, that so many African-American children are being suspended rather than treated. When we look at categories of special ed, we know that African-American children are more likely to end up with the behavioral disorders. We know that they're underdiagnosed with autism. I said that once and I was asked, well, what happens to Black kids with autism? And I said, they get suspended and punished rather than treated. So my own mom was a disabled woman who was forced to go into a set-aside program, and those days they were institutionalized. So she was not only in a school, but she was in a totally separate building for children with handicaps. My grandmother was very forceful, very much like Mary Louise said, she was a hero, and forced my mother to go into forced public schools to allow my mother to go there. But I'm very concerned about what happens to Black children who have disabilities, especially in those areas where they're underrepresented, where they need the services. But I'm also concerned about the overrepresentation in behavioral disorders.
Yeah, and there's a whole discussion about that in the report. We definitely look at that intersection. ML, do you want to chime in, Mary Louise?
Yeah, I was just going to kind of chime in on what Rosemarie just said, and I won't push it too much. But, you know, I think there's this trajectory that starts when young Black boys are suspended from pre-K or childcare when they're 2. And what we know about that is that the more you're suspended, the more likely you're going to start school and get labeled as a child with a behavior problem or behavior emotional disorder. Once you get that label, you're going to be you're more likely to be in a segregated setting, and you're not likely to move out of a segregated classroom. And the longer you're in a segregated classroom, the less likely you are to finish school, and then the more likely you are to have problems after school. And so I think that our young Black boys, young boys of color in general, are getting suspended and expelled, and that sets them up to be labeled as a child with a disability, when I think, Rosemarie, you're exactly right. We haven't treated them, we haven't supported them, we haven't even attempted to set them on a different trajectory.
I think excellent answers to all of those questions. I want to just turn now to Rosemarie and ask you one question. You've been in pretty much every part of the early childhood system. I think when I first met you, you were a state administrator, and you've been in so many parts of this community. From your experience, what's your advice to us? What do we need to do now that will change this system?
Thank you so much for that, Linda. And what I found over the life of my career is that teachers enter into this field because they want to positively impact the lives of young children. as long as I've been teaching in teacher ed programs, I've never met a teacher who said, I want to get my degree, pay all of this money, take out student loans so that I can suspend and cause harm. So I believe that teachers need the support in order to really address the unique needs of children. Right now, we are more segregated in our neighborhoods, in our lives, even in our places of employment than ever before. We don't know each other very well. We've not been taught how to live together. We don't know how to address the unique needs of this very diverse population that Dr. Garcia talked about. When we have 80% or more of our teaching staff who are white women who have not been exposed to children of color, there are bound to be problems. So what we need to do is provide professional development activities for our teaching workforce in order to change hearts. And when we change hearts, we can change practices. But I have worked with students who have never been outside of their affluent, upper middle class environment, working with children who are not English speakers, who are from a low socioeconomic background, whose culture is uniquely different from theirs, and they have no idea what to do. And they view them through their own limited lens and through their own cultural perspective. So I think that's one of the things we need to do. And then once we provide the professional development activities, we have to provide the support. We have to support the teachers where they are, give them many opportunities to practice these new skills and to incentivize them for moving farther. We also have to provide incentives for our workforce of color to move up. We say we value diversity, but what consistently, when you look across our programs, it is Black and brown people who are on the ground level working directly with our children while the leadership is white. So we have to provide incentives to diversify the leadership from the very top.
Wow, that's a lot impact in that, but there's no question that professional development in this field is necessary. And I think that goes straight back also to the early childhood workforce and the pay issues and being able to attract and retain the kind of people and staff that we need. I want to bounce this over to Mary Louise right now and just sort of, we're running out of time here, but Mary Louise, you've spent a lot of time working on inclusion and social emotional development of children. And I continue to struggle with why do we still have such a problem, and why haven't we done a better job in terms of helping teachers and everyone else understand the importance of social emotional development in children. And for so many years, we spent so much time on cognitive development and ignored social emotional. And it's very frustrating. What do you recommend that we do moving forward on this?
Yeah, I think, Linda, that I was thinking about this in preparation for this report or this webinar. I was thinking about if you would have told me 20 years ago everything that would happen in these 20 years, I would have thought that we would be at a good place now. So it's a little shocking that we're here and we're not at a better place. So I think it goes back to we continue to have debates about social emotional development versus academics when that is not a legitimate debate, that it's all important, that we have to do it all, that we have to have good social emotional foundations to be able to do good academics. I think that we haven't sufficiently helped people understand the relationship between social emotional development and behavior issues. And we see behavior as something we have to get rid of rather than an opportunity to teach and support kids. But I think it ultimately goes back to what you and Rosemary were just saying, which is about support for teachers. And that's not, I'm not putting this on the backs of teachers. Teachers understand that they need more training around this. When you ask them what they want training around, they want training around social, emotional, and behavior. And that's telling me that we're not doing something well. We can't just keep doing training because we've been doing a lot of that for the last 20 years and we're still having teachers report that. I think it's about building systems of support for children and teachers and families and administrators that really uses what we know about good implementation science.
Interesting. Well, Jean, this is going to give you the last word on this, but you've been a professor, a teacher. Your wife's a teacher. You have a daughter who's a teacher. I have a daughter who's a teacher. What advice do you want to give us in closing this out in terms of how we do work with our teachers and our workforce, and what can we do to improve what Rosemary and Mary Louise just talked about in terms of social emotional, helping teachers understand this?
Well, let me put this in the context of this report. What this report does is shine a light on these issues that are really critical and important to the society, these issues of inequities. And certainly in 3 areas, but they're across all sectors of this society. So one of the things this report does, and we need to continue to do, is increase the wattage of the light. We need to do it continuously. This again, what worries me is that it disappears. It becomes invisible. And we live with these inequities as if it's a normal part of life. It isn't. For many kids and families and communities, it is not. It is harsh. It is a real problem. We have to continue to shine the light as many times as we can and increase that wattage. Now, as a dean, sir, we have to produce better individuals who can go out in that workforce. As researchers, we have to increase that knowledge base, but we have to continue to shine the light. And this report essentially does that, and I appreciate that.
Okay. Well, I'm going to turn it. Thank you to all of you. Such an amazing conversation, and it's so many things to think about. I'm going to turn it back over to Chantel now, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the next webinars that we're going to have, where we dig into each of these issues. But in hindsight, I just want to say that this has been a labor of love, as you know, for Chantel, but for the 70 people who helped us work on this report. We hope this is just the beginning of a conversation that changes things substantially in this country. So Chantel, I'm going to give it back over to you, and thank you, my dear.
Thank you, and thank you all. I'm gonna share my screen one last time just to show the dates for our next webinars. So as I mentioned, when we opened up, we are hosting 3 subsequent webinars, 1 a week starting next week that are going to take a deeper dive into each of the 3 issue areas that we covered here. We have a really exciting lineup of change makers and advocates and researchers and policymakers who have been doing work in this space for a really long time lined up. So the dates are up here. The 2 websites, the Children's Equity Project website and the Bipartisan Policy Center's website is down there at the bottom. You can sign up for the webinars there. If you are not on our listserv, you can also get onto our listserv through the invitations that we already sent you. So we hope as many of you as possible can join us for those as we take a deeper dive and really start to explore in greater depth what we found, what folks are doing about it, and what a path forward could be to create more equitable systems for kids and families, which is our ultimate goal. So thank you again. Thank you, Rosemary and Mary Louise and Jean and Linda and the Bipartisan Policy Center for your partnership in this. Thank you to the many authors and contributors and to the over 70 folks who came together for this. I hope that our field can use this as a concrete and actionable pathway forward in policy at all levels. So thanks again. Please join us for the other webinars. We hope you lift this up on social media. You can use the hashtag #StartWithEquity. And other than that, thanks so much and have a great rest of your evening.